Hi, and welcome to a special voter fraud episode of InstaVision. We'll be fraudulently no, we're actually not going to be doing any voter fraud ourselves. We'll be talking to John Fund. He's the author, with Hans Van Spakovsky, of Who's Counting? How Fraudsters and Bureaucrats Put Your Vote at Risk. It's a must-read for this election cycle, and I'm sorry to say it may remain a must-read after this election cycle. Well, welcome, John. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Glenn.
So now, I've been assured by many leading Democratic pundits, by which I think I mean basically all leading Democratic pundits, that voter fraud is non-existent. It's just a GOP scare tactic, and I don't need to be concerned at all. Don't tell me that's wrong.
Glenn, you've written a lot about the gulf between our self-appointed and self-selected leaders and the American people. On this issue, the gulf could not be any wider. According to Rasmussen, 64% of Americans believe voter fraud is a serious or somewhat serious issue. In fact, African Americans believe the same thing by a point higher than white Americans. The latest Washington Post poll finds 74% of Americans believe voter ID laws are appropriate. 37 out of 38 demographic categories show majority support. The only one that comes short is liberal Democrats, who are at 48%. Democrats in general are at 60%. So the public is on one side, the political elite is on the other, and they have absolutely no facts on this. There is voter fraud. There are documents showing at least 100 examples of recent vintage in my book. We had a voter fraud case a few years ago that changed history. Al Franken in Minnesota supposedly won by 312 votes after an 8-month legal battle. And he got sent to the Senate, and he became the 60th Democratic vote for Obamacare. They needed 60 votes to break a filibuster. Well, we got Obamacare because of Al Franken. Now we know, once Al Franken has been seated, a group called Minnesota Majority, a watchdog group, found that there were 1,100 felons who voted illegally in that election. Now, we don't know for sure how felons vote, but we do know in states where they register by party, it's about 75% Democratic. And when Fox News found 10 of these felons who'd voted illegally in Minnesota, they asked them who they voted for. 9 out of 10 said Franken. So the prosecutors even got involved. Of these 1,100 felons, all you had to do to avoid prosecution for voting illegally is say, I made a mistake. And you can't be prosecuted because you don't have intent. But those who were stupid enough to say, not only did I vote illegally, but I knew what I was doing, they have now convicted 191 of those people, 66 more in the pipeline, dozens more are being investigated. Glenn, we may get to the point where more people have been convicted of voting illegally in that Franken election that changed history than the margin of victory.
That sounds possible. And I like the idea of starting a group called Felons for Franken. I think that would be a good bumper sticker in Minnesota.
Well, they made the difference.
Spread that one around. Well, so that's Minnesota. How widespread is the problem?
Well, some states are pretty clean. Some states have long traditions of voter fraud, and it can be bipartisan. Kentucky has counties where Republicans have been stealing votes for years, except there it's not a $20 bill to buy your vote, it's a fifth of bourbon. But big city machines, we used to have Republican big city machines, Aldomado's, Nassau County, Chicago, Philadelphia, but those have all gone away and been replaced by nothing or Democratic machines. So both parties commit voter fraud, but one party has a much bigger opportunity because they run the only political machines left in this country, and that would be mostly Democrats.
So tell us what happened in Mississippi.
Well, Mississippi was a sad case because 50 years ago, Noxubee County in the highlands of Mississippi was a place where white racists prevented blacks from registering and voting. The civil rights legislation came in. We needed it. We got rid of poll taxes, literacy tests. But now, 50 years later, a new political boss emerged named Ike Brown. And what he did is he basically started stealing votes on behalf of his friends and cronies. And the people of the Justice Department, the career bureaucrats, didn't want to prosecute because they said, well, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act are there to protect black people. And there were political superiors in the Bush Justice Department said, no, this is not black versus white, this is right versus wrong. And they pursued the case, and the guy was thrown out of office, and the entire system was shut down by a federal judge. But sadly, the same career bureaucrats who didn't want to go after Ike Brown in Noxubee County, Mississippi, are now running the department for Eric Holder. And Eric Holder is blocking every voter ID law known to man that he can. And the irony is that Eric Holder's administration is almost like a walking poster advertisement for problems with voter fraud. Eric Holder has lived in the same neighborhood in Washington for 32 years. Yet last May in the Democratic primary, a 22-year-old white kid with earrings and a beard showed up and said, do you have an Eric Holder on your list at such and such an address? And they said, sure, here's your ballot. He didn't vote it because that would have been a crime, but that just shows you how easy voter fraud can happen. And Eric Holder is so preposterous. He denounced voter fraud as Jim Crow and poll taxes at a NAACP convention in Houston recently. But Glenn, did you know what people who wanted to see that speech had to show before they could get into the hall? They had to show an ID to get in to see Eric Holder denounce IDs.
They did. So Eric Holder's Justice Department has looks like it's guilty of a racial double standard here. If you'll see these Black Panthers standing out front of the polling place telling people how they're supposed to vote, I can't imagine that they would ignore it if it was a bunch of white people in uniforms with weapons doing the same thing. What gives with that?
Well, it was a notorious double standard, very much like the reaction to the Knoxville, Mississippi case. But you know, I've traveled all over the country, Glenn. The real victims of voter fraud, in most cases, often are minorities, because they're corrupt political machines in Philadelphia, Detroit, St. Louis, other places that, you know, take lots of money from the residents of the cities, deliver bad schools, bad roads, bad services. When reformers try to fight them and defeat them at the polls, they often are the victims of voter fraud. Kwame Kilpatrick, the corrupt mayor of Detroit, who later went to prison, he won his second term through absentee ballot fraud that was so bad the city clerk of Detroit had to be removed from office for it. So it's actually minorities who would benefit in many places if we cleaned up the polls, cleaned up the voter registration lists.
Well, I hope we'll have something happen on that. And last question, what should people do if people think this is a problem?
Well, there's several things. TrueTheVote.org is a volunteer organization that's trying to have hundreds of thousands of poll watchers, people who clean up the system. You know, our voter registration rolls, the Pew Research Center, a liberal organization, says we have 1 out of 8 registrations are invalid or have major errors. People could comb through those registration lists and spot the problems. You know, we have 2 million dead people in our registration rolls, Glenn. I believe we should honor the dead, but I don't believe in representation without respiration. So True the Vote is one thing. Just talking about the issue, just letting people know someone is watching can help. Voter fraud is very much like shoplifting. You take a few basic precautions, you can reduce voter fraud, like you can reduce shoplifting by 25–30%, some people estimate, simply because there are people who won't do it if it's not a completely risk-free activity.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to join us and making it perhaps a little less risk-free in the future.
And the book is Who's Counting? How Fraudsters and Bureaucrats Put Your Vote at Risk. Thanks, Glenn.
That's right. That's John Fund. He is the author with Hans Van Spakovsky of Who's Counting? How Fraudsters and Bureaucrats Put Your Vote at Risk. Pick it up at Amazon.com, Barnes & Noble, or anywhere fine books are sold. Thank you for taking the time to join us, and we'll see you next week. In the meantime, have fun on the Internet. Thanks.